Chris Tucker has always been one of those comedians who could walk into any room, stand next to the biggest celebrities in the world, and somehow still become the funniest person there. Whether he was hanging out with Michael Jackson, joking with Jackie Chan, roasting Prince, or borrowing Ferraris from Charlie Sheen, every moment around him turned into comedy. And honestly, nobody made celebrities laugh harder than Chris Tucker. One of the funniest friendships Chris ever had was with Michael Jackson. The two became surprisingly close over the years, and according to Chris, hanging out with Michael was always an adventure. They both loved going to the movies together, but going anywhere with Michael Jackson was never simple. Michael was so famous that he couldn't just casually walk into a theater like a normal person. He had to sneak in at the last possible second wearing disguises so nobody would recognize him. Chris remembered sitting inside the theater one night wondering where Michael disappeared to. Suddenly, he heard somebody whisper behind him, "Hey, Chris." Chris turned around and almost jumped out of his seat. "Oh man, how long you been here?" Michael calmly replied, "About 5 minutes." That's what made the whole thing so funny. Michael would arrive dressed like a ninja in all black, completely hidden, acting like some secret agent trying not to be seen. But the second the movie started, he became the loudest person in the entire theater. Michael would laugh louder than everyone else combined, and Chris would sit there embarrassed whispering, "Michael, shut up." According to Chris, he could make Michael Jackson completely lose control laughing almost every time they were together. And considering how reserved Michael usually was around people, that says a lot. But Michael wasn't just funny. He was unbelievably generous too. Chris once visited Michael's house and casually complimented a giant flat-screen TV sitting in the room. He didn't even ask for it. He simply said it looked nice. A few moments later, Michael told somebody to take the TV and give it to Chris. Chris was shocked. "Michael, I didn't want the TV." Then Chris joked, "But then the black side of me came out. After that, I started liking everything in the house." That became one of his favorite stories because it perfectly described how kind Michael could be. Chris said being around Michael just made people happy. Michael treated his friends with so much warmth that it almost didn't feel real. Their friendship became so close that Chris once spent a ridiculous amount of money just to see him. Chris had flown to New York on a private jet because Michael told him he wanted to see him after Rush Hour came out. Before flying, Chris kept leaving messages saying, "Michael, I'm in New York. If you're around, let me know." But Michael never responded. Eventually Chris gave up and flew all the way back to Los Angeles on the same private plane. But the second he landed, he got a message from Michael Jackson's office saying, "Michael wants to see you tomorrow in New York." Chris immediately walked back to the pilots and said, "Turn the plane around." The pilots warned him how expensive it would be, but Chris didn't care. He just handed over his credit card and flew all the way back to New York again. Later he laughed about it saying, "I don't even know how much that cost. It was crazy, but it was worth every dollar." That was the kind of effect Michael Jackson had on people. Another hilarious story involved Jackie Chan. Chris and Jackie became one of the greatest comedy duos ever thanks to Rush Hour, but behind-the-scenes things were somehow even funnier. Chris admitted that during filming he kept accidentally calling Jackie by his real name instead of his character name, Lee. Every time he messed up, the director would yell, "His name is Lee, goddammit." Jackie just laughed through it all because he was incredibly patient with Chris. In fact, Jackie was almost too nice. Chris said Jackie Chan would send gifts to his trailer almost every single day during the filming of the first Rush Hour movie. Chris started getting confused. What is going on? Why is this man so nice? Eventually Chris realized. Wait a minute, Jackie from China. They probably made this stuff over there anyway. Even their very first meeting was awkward in the funniest possible way. Chris said when they first sat down together before filming, Jackie barely spoke. Throughout the entire meeting, Jackie just sat there quietly nodding his head. Okay. Chris became genuinely worried. After the meeting, he pulled the director aside and whispered, "Does he even speak English? There's no way we can do this movie if he can't communicate with me." The director laughed and explained, "He's just checking you out. That misunderstanding became the beginning of one of Hollywood's most iconic friendships. And Jackie didn't just show Chris around movie sets. When Chris visited Hong Kong and China, Jackie treated the entire country like it belonged to him. Chris said Jackie would casually point at giant buildings and hotels saying, "You like this hotel? That's my hotel." Chris couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, Jackie would walk through crowds surrounded by security and huge groups of people, while Chris struggled to keep up behind him yelling, "Jackie, wait up. This don't look right. We supposed to be together." Chris also had unbelievable stories about Prince. One night Chris was hanging out at a club in Los Angeles when Prince's security suddenly walked over and said, "Prince wants to meet you." Chris thought they were joking. When he entered the VIP section, Prince immediately told him, "You played that role in The Fifth Element. I was supposed to play that role." Chris was surprised until Prince explained he turned it down because he didn't like the costumes. Chris looked Prince up and down and said, "But you got your butt hanging out your pants." Even Prince couldn't argue with that. Chris also joked about how tiny Prince was, saying he was so short you could probably see his feet in his driver's license photo. But despite constantly making fun of people, celebrities loved being around Chris because he never acted fake around them. He treated superstars exactly the same way he treated everybody else. That's why Ben Affleck once joked that Chris Tucker somehow knew literally everyone on Earth. Ben said you could mention any famous person alive and Chris would casually respond, "Yeah, that's my boy." Michael Jordan? His boy. Muhammad Ali? His boy. Paul McCartney? His boy. At one point Chris even joked that people would ask where he was and he'd say, "I'm in Saudi Arabia with the king." And honestly, with Chris Tucker, that story sounded believable. But no matter how famous or rich he became, Chris still acted like a regular guy. Back home in Atlanta, people would walk up to him in grocery stores completely shocked to see him shopping like a normal human being. Chris would say, "What you think I am? A superhero? I gotta eat too." He also admitted that he hated neighbors who borrowed things and never returned them. "You ever had a neighbor borrow something so long you gotta borrow it back?" Then he'd yell, "No, that's my broom." Chris grew up with 5 siblings, so he learned early how to survive in a crowded household. He said whenever his mother bought cupcakes, the kids would secretly hide some before the others could eat them. Then when the mom noticed cupcakes missing, everybody pretended they had no idea what happened. That same chaotic energy followed Chris into adulthood. When he first became rich, he made some unbelievably ridiculous financial decisions. He admitted he started spending money like crazy because he'd never had that kind of wealth before. At one point, he bought 2 giant houses right next to each other simply because he didn't want neighbors bothering him. Chris laughed, saying, "I was borrowing sugar from myself." Even Kevin Hart experienced Chris Tucker chaos firsthand. Kevin said he was buying his first house in Los Angeles during the time Chris was dealing with tax problems. While Kevin was touring the house, Chris suddenly appeared outside yelling, "Pay your taxes, man." Then he casually walked away. Kevin was completely confused. Chris later explained he was simply trying to help. And then there were Chris Tucker's impressions. His Michael Jackson impression was legendary because he perfectly captured Michael's soft voice and nervous energy. Chris joked that if you went to Michael Jordan's house wearing the wrong shoes, Jordan would immediately stare at your feet and judge you. "Reeboks? You crazy." His Donald Trump impression was equally hilarious. "Believe me, Chris Tucker? Great comedian. Great guy." He also spent time traveling through Africa with Bill Clinton. During the trip, Chris kept imitating Clinton's voice until Clinton himself started laughing and encouraging him to continue. Chris said Clinton eventually invited him personally, saying, "Tucker, you should come to Africa with me. You black. I'm black. You'll love it." And somehow, Chris could make even that sound hilarious. But maybe the funniest thing about Chris Tucker is that his personality never changes no matter who he's around. Whether he's standing next to Michael Jackson, Prince, Jackie Chan, or presidents, he still acts like the same loud, fearless comedian from Atlanta who isn't afraid to joke about anything. That's why celebrities love him. Because around Chris Tucker, nobody gets treated like royalty. Everybody becomes part of the joke.